You're listening to the StatsBomb Football Podcast.
One half a step too late or too early, and you don't quite make it. 1/2 second too slow, too fast, you don't quite catch it. The inches we need are everywhere around us.
Welcome back to the StatsBomb Football Podcast. I am your host, Seth Partnow, Director of North American Sports here at StatsBomb. I am joined this week again by CEO Ted Knutson.
Hello, I'm CEO.
and head of football analysis, Matt Edwards, the coach. How's it going, Matt?
The coach is a little bit late this time. We'll work on that for next time. Coach Matt Edwards. We'll get it. We'll get there by maybe next pod.
We get better every day, which is the point of analytics in general. And that actually is a good segue into if you're going to be in Indy at the Combine or at Sloan in Boston next week. Hit us up, email, Twitter, what have you, if you want to say hi. All three of us will be in Indy, and Ted and I will be at Sloan, where rumor has it Ted may even be on stage at some point.
Yeah, I thought I was gonna get a freebie and just like skate through this one, but apparently they're putting me to work again. So they have not blocked my Twitter account either yet, like the director of NFL analytics. But there's still hope for all of us, I think is where this comes around to. Also, when you segued there, I thought for a second that we had a sponsor for the podcast, and I was like, this is amazing. I was like, we're gonna manscape right now. We're gonna talk about easy greens or something. Like, what's going on?
Oh, so Ted was singing right before we started singing songs that would fit perfectly in with a Manscaped live read. So thankfully that is not the case. So I wanted to start, and one of the aspects that is sort of never ending about working in the sports data space is there are arguments that never die. And these zombie arguments, these zombie objections to why, that stuff just doesn't work here. And it's on one hand frustrating, but on the other hand, an endless source of things to talk about to kind of identify and sort of knock down some of these objections. So we're going to try this out, a weekly segment, which I've very inventively titled Objection of the Week. And we'll get a two for this week. And they both sort of come out of the same quote from former Steelers GM Kevin Colbert. He was talking on, I believe, the North Catholic Athletics podcast, but it went kind of viral.
We had analytic people, and I used to challenge them. I said, when you guys can measure the intangibles, let me know, because that's the most important thing.
Now, this caused a lot of people to, make Old Man Yells at Cloud kind of references and stuff like that. But I wanted to talk about that with this group and just identify just where exactly this sort of misunderstands both the substance and role of statistics, analytics, mathematical analysis, however you want to describe it, technology. Ted, you've run obviously into similar objections into multiple forms of football. So let me kick it to you and sort of get your reaction to that and what he's missing.
There's like so many old stories you could tell on the soccer side of things, where you're like, you get to Harry Redknapp, is sort of the inaugural one, and back in like maybe 2007 or something, like there was a Prozone analyst down there, and they were talking about what the computer said or something like that. It's like we're gonna let your fucking laptop play their fucking laptop, and then we'll see what happens in the game, and that'll be the result. This is totally apocryphal. I don't know. I've actually met the guy, so I think it's real, but it's that type of thing where you think so many stuff about, this is just how I think about the world, right? And I think recently, this past week, there was misuse stats meme around analytics Twitter, and which one is like your least favorite or your most irritating. This sort of thing is like that, like, this is how I think it actually works. But the reality is like no real contact with what analytics look like. There's so many different things you can measure, right? And many of the things that you measure are wrong. They don't lead to performance, which is what you really care about. Then the other bit that you get wrong about this is like, how good is your estimation or your scout's estimation or your coach's estimation around the intangibles and the impact that those things have, right? And what we find in humans in general is that our estimation and our confidence around what we think is correct in our estimation is wrong. And is wrong regularly. And it's not even wrong directionally, right? So like it's sort of random variation around the mean, but you don't know the degrees around it. So this is like super nerdy ways of saying, hey, coach, what we found in analytics across multiple sports is that your eyes and your intuition might be good in certain instances and wrong, badly wrong across the population. For X players in soccer, it would be, oh, he should have, he needs to hit the target there. That was an easy chance. That was a golden chance at goal. It was this, it was that. And then when you ask them about that, and you could play back every time that they've had clips around him, and then you look back at their career, and like, all right, sir, you were one of the best scoring forwards in soccer for your entire career. You only scored like 25, 30 goals a year. If it were as easy as you're saying it was, even for awesome you would have scored something like 60 or 90 goals a year, but you didn't. So your estimation on the quality of any particular chance is this poor. Now, the intangibles thing I think is a little bit interesting because I think actually basketball has probably gone the furthest to try and quantify this in an obvious external way, talking about chemistry and different lineups, and this is what this lineup does and shit like that. And so I think it's a good spot for you to step in and discuss it. But also, there's a lot that actually has been done in order to quantify this that this guy is like completely unaware of, but he's just using it as a throwaway comment.
Yes. First, I want to bring Matt in to give him his thoughts on this in terms of, I think that the misnomer here to me is that the notion that we, painting as a broad brush people from an analytic bent, don't recognize that quote unquote intangibles exist or that they matter. So my question for you, Matt, is how do you hold those two ideas, and we can quantify these things that are important, these other things that we are pretty sure are important, we can't really quantify. How do we harmonize those two things together?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and something that is pretty well documented in statistics research is the ability to work with quantitative data as well as qualitative data, right? Like if you're going to work with intangibles or other things like how well people are sleeping, how well they feel that day, how well they are eating, and other things like that, like you can do work with that type of data. And so, just using this as I think Ted mentioned, like a throwaway of, they can't really do stuff with qualitative data. That's not necessarily true. And at the end of the day, they are the royal they of people who are anti-analytics or just not using analytics are quantifying it in some way on their own, right? They're saying, yes, this person has the intangibles or no. So they have maybe a binary yes or no. And so they're doing something to use some sort of qualification for these players. So I think that the just broad dismissal of either side of coaching, film, analytics, sports science, whatever it is it's just bad practice.
Scouting reports are data. They're information. Like data should just be information, right? We had analytics people. We had information people that gave us different sources of information than these other guys. Here's a classic fucking scouting thing that like used to drive me insane. I like to be in person to watch them because I want to see how they warm up and I want to see what they look like on the sideline. Like, oh, I didn't like his warm up today. He looked angry. Like when he came off, he was frustrated. Like, what was he frustrated about, coach? Like, was he frustrated that he didn't have a good performance? Was he frustrated that he thought he could do better? Was he frustrated that his teammates didn't pass to him enough in certain situations? Was he frustrated with himself because he thought that he should have scored a goal in a particular situation? He missed out on that. Was he irritated that his girlfriend was found at a nightclub last night cheating on him, and he found that out minutes before the game, and like now that he was not on the field anymore, that's what he was pissed off about? He could be frustrated about anything at all, and you have no idea what it is, and yet you're using this as an angle to judge him in a no context situation.
Yeah, I think what you're saying there with like the term of analytics or data or whatever you want to use is really interesting. I was just talking with somebody who works in college football that asked to not have analytics in his title because of the scary nature of that word for a lot of coaches. So his title, he asked just to have data, or he's like, I think it would be easier for people to accept that than having somebody say analytics and have that kind of be a little bit scary. And so I think that the way you frame stuff is so important when you're dealing with, whoever really. And
just talk football.
Sometimes as simple as just the nomenclature of the sport, like you're saying.
But there's a lot of load on it, and the translator position where you're talking the sport, but you're also bringing in outside sources of information. Like it's a pretty big load, because you have to have bits of jargon. You have to understand the sport well enough to provide it, which is one reason why the academic space is often pretty poor at integrating with the team space, because like they just don't have that connectivity of language, and that's a trouble bit. So Seth, let's circle back around to some of basketball's experiments before we actually get deeper into the sport. And I have one more story about the Steelers in particular that we'll wrap up this segment with, because it's a little bit long. But talk to us a little bit about basketball's experiments with intangibles and things that are loosely tangible or squishily tangible.
As you guys are both either alluding to or being explicit about, there's the definition of what we're actually talking about matters a great deal. If we're talking about intangibles in terms of sort of chemistry, on court, on field, on ice, on pitch, synergy between players and their skill sets, that's something that I don't think that is difficult to measure, but I think it is tangible insofar as assuming we had perfect information about how inputs lead to outputs. If it didn't matter on the scoreboard, on the output, then it doesn't matter, and why do we care? But I think we all, having participated in either as participants, direct on-field participants, or sort of in management, coaching, what have you, at sports at a high level, I think we all believe that these things matter. What's the order of magnitude of that mattering? How much does it change your analysis? I think a mistake that gets made a lot, especially in the context of football, is that these intangibles are seen as like the massive thumb on the scale veto wins the argument. But like, you can be a nice guy all you want, and that doesn't let you run a 4.340. So there's a certain limit to that. And the other part of it is the interpersonal connectivity. And we all know, we've all been around people in a work setting or in a sports competitive setting. Someone's just a drag to be around, and you don't like that. And it hurts the group. How much does it hurt the group? I don't know. But I don't think you dismiss that as something that's important. You're just saying, hey, we don't really have a good way of measuring that. It may be in like sort of industrial economics, there are some measures of that, but how well those techniques apply to sort of elite level play, elite level of anything, like do those measures apply to Navy SEAL training? I don't know. It's a great question. I did some sorry in advance that I did some preliminary research on that for my book, and realized, this is very complicated and I'm not equipped to write about this at all yet. More specifically in terms of basketball, yeah, we do analysis of, all right, what is the impact if you have 2 shooters on the court, 3, 4, 5, and like what the value of that as an additive skill is. I've had a long running question with Eric Eager over at Sumer, kind of equating the standstill corner 3-point shooter with a receiver who doesn't do anything but run go routes. And maybe he doesn't get the ball, maybe he's not particularly good, but just his presence doing that has an effect of widening the space on the field for everybody else. Now, do we have a great way of measuring that impact yet? No.
We do. I bet we do. I bet it's in the data, and we could actually look at it, right? So like let's look at Tyreek Hill. And let's look at the compression of any particular coverage when he runs a go versus when he's not, right? And Tyreek's a pretty good example. And then like let's look at some fairly average receivers, and like let's sort of cluster that. I think it's really interesting, right? Because like compression of the defense, or defense in sort of their hotspots, right? Like and hotspots can be any number of things. Like you're choosing a coverage based off of what you think is most likely to be successful against this particular alignment and this particular personnel grouping and this particular situation. This is the context that we talked about in episode 1 about how like it's insanely contextual. But like I think that with the right tracking data, you can start to measure that type of stuff. And I think that that's an interesting lead. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the positional conversation we're going to have in a second. Coming back to this particular organization, I know somebody who is in touch with one of the owners, and it's interesting this came out of the Steelers, because the Steelers is the one place where it seems like the higher ups have been most frustrated that they couldn't get more analytics presence inside of an organization and get it to stick. And it has not happened. There's a difficulty in changing the culture of some of these teams, especially when you kind of have a Hall of Fame level coach. Hey, he's a really good coach. Like, yeah, it's true. But would he be a better coach if he had better information to be able to make decisions or incorporated a little bit of additional outside stuff? Probably. And where does that information going to come from? Well, it's probably not from better scouting at this point. I mean, maybe better offensive coordinator would be an early choice for the Steelers as well. We have a Steelers fan who runs our product on the American football side, and his misery at having the state of Pennsylvania and not great offensive coordinators, especially outside of Philadelphia, has been going on for a couple of seasons. It's both fun for the rest of us to watch, but painful, I'm sure, for him.
I think that's a great point, and that leads into sort of the second half of this sort of objection, which is the appeal to perfection, which is, okay, you can't tell me everything possible about this scenario, therefore you can't tell me anything. And I've always found that particularly frustrating because these decisions are hard, predictions are hard. If they were easy, you wouldn't need this superstructure of scouting and information and tape grinding to try to winkle out those little edges. It's hard to figure out, but we want to give ourselves the best chance at it. And I think we wanted to talk a little bit about linebackers today, in part because I read an excellent article that I shared with you guys from a friend of the program, Ian Boyd. His Substack, America's War Game, I think is a great. Great. I would encourage people to subscribe. But he wrote an article last week discussing that we all know that quarterback is a hard position to find, both because playing quarterback at the NFL level is very difficult, but also because playing quarterback at the NFL level is more different than playing quarterback at the college level versus playing it at the high school level than probably any other position. He identified linebackers as the position that is second most accurate in terms of what a great high school program wants to see from their linebackers versus a collegiate program versus an NFL organization. So, Matt, can you give a little bit more light on what that means and the degree to which you think that's correct?
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting article as well. And to me, I think the biggest thing that you think about when you talk about moving up a level, whether it's high school to college, or you look at the transfer portal, guys going from FCS to FBS or Group of Five to Power Five, Power Four, I guess now, Power Two, who knows what we're actually going to end at, but one of the upper levels. And then from college to the NFL is the speed of the game, as well as the complexity of what you're being asked to do and how that changes from level to level. And so for linebackers, in high school, it's just see ball, get ball. And it's really easy to just track down the ball carrier. High school is generally running based offenses. It's depending on where you are. Ian's in Texas and they're pretty advanced in their high school football, spread offenses and stuff, but it's still very much see ball, get ball. You don't have to do a lot of thinking. When you go up a level into college, it is much trickier. You have to worry about schematic differences, and it's not just individual level, it's scheme and what you're being asked to do. And so I think that's the bigger deal when you're looking at translating from one level to the next is, what you're being asked to do and how it varies from what you've done in the past. And so, there are good examples of I just wrote an article for StatsBomb. I know we're talking about linebackers here, but about defensive backs and the increase in what they're being asked to do. It's no longer just the receiver, cover receiver. They're being asked to blitz. They're being asked to cover tight ends in the slot, drop back into coverage. Trent McDuffie easily could have been the MVP of the Super Bowl with the plays that he made, shutting down Deebo Samuel, the way that he blitzed and, batted down the pass. And so, there are players like that. One example is Mike Sainristil out of Michigan, who has very similar numbers and what he was being asked to do at Michigan to Trent McDuffie. He played some corner, he played some nickel safety, he blitzed, he kind of does a lot of everything. And so I think, to me, that's the bigger deal when you're looking at how difficult it's going to be for a player to transition from one level to the next, is what have they shown that they're able to do, and then what are we going to have them do? And I think the great coaches are able to take what a player can do and morph that into their scheme. If it's, hey, we've got this one linebacker who can only play run defense, put him only in run defense situations and let him grow. And then, don't have him out there trying to cover Travis Kelce and say, all right, well, good luck. There's a good example of somebody from Ohio State trying to cover a Clemson guy. I think this was a couple years ago, and just a run stuffing linebacker trying to stay with, I think it was Travis Etienne. And, it's on the coach at that point. It's not on the player. Like, the coach knows this is what my player can do, and putting them in bad situations, I think, is where you run into trouble there.
I think one of the things that comes up there is that, so first of all, with the linebacker in particular, in modern linebacker, you're like down a dude and sometimes down two dudes versus what it used to be, right? And so you've now got fewer guys on the field that directly do your job. Your job also has now extended to covering elite wide receiver level tight ends, right? And it used to be that those were only a few guys in the league. Now, so many offenses are looking for guys like that, but you also look like a Debo who's coming out of the backfield, and you don't know where he's going to end up, and you don't know what his pattern looks like. Or you're looking at Christian McCaffrey's, who, like, there used to be more versatility in like the running back spot, I think. Now we're kind of like dialing back up there. So what you're seeing is the positional diversity and versatility in the offensive weapons has really morphed what's happening at the linebacker level. And that happens, in a big jump from high school to say the good programs in college. And then it happens a much bigger jump up in the NFL, because the interesting thing about the NFL is, like, everybody's freak. Like, everybody's a freakish athlete, but there are degrees of freak. And Seth and I have talked about this so many times. We're like, you might have been a good D3 athlete. You are so far away from an NBA player, it's unbelievable. This is true in the NFL as well. And this is why, like, so many of these bets, like, would you, $1 million if you can get, 10 yards on 10 rushes from the line of scrimmage or something like that. It's absurd. So what happens is you get into this spot and you're pulled in so many different directions. There are fewer guys that do that. And also your scheme is particularly relevant to what your job actually is, right? So you get a striker that's sort of the nickel safety / linebacker that does more blitzing, but he's also there for run stuffing on wide runs and wide zone situations, stuff like that. Or you get, two guys that are just unbelievable freaks that are expected to fit the run every single time in the middle of the field, to be able to go out wide and blow those things up too as it gets stretched out from the defensive line. And then, run like a track athlete, guys who are 6'5", who are, 220, 30, 40, 50 pounds, that sort of similar size, but bigger than you, and out there in the receiving space. And one thing I found particularly interesting last year, and maybe we can talk a little bit about this, was there's a team that we think are really great at evaluating players with analytics. They've been one of the early movers for probably over a decade at doing it. And I am an unfortunate longtime by birth Bears fan. I'm also a 49ers fan because for some reason they were better than the Bears for a long time. And I got on with Joe Montana. So I have a bit of morphed fandom there. But nevertheless, the Baltimore Ravens went and they jumped in for Roquan Smith last year, right? And that was like quite a controversial thing because Roquan at the Bears was great, but then people were like, oh yeah, we don't want to pay for him or anything like that. That's like too much money. We'll get whatever we can for him. And the Ravens jumped in and like they put like a decent pot in front of the Bears in order to get Roquan. And he has completely made that defense like, a rock again. Most of the time, what we hear from the analytics groups is that linebacker is not a high analytics positional value position, right? But I think what you can see is that if you're great at figuring out the skill set of these guys with data, you can make these gambles and these bets that look unusual to the rest of the world. But for them, they're like, look, this is a lock. We think this guy is one of the two best positional players in the league, and he fits our scheme perfectly. And we think he's got a few more years on him. I think that gets lost in some of the value judgments that you're looking at. If you're better able to evaluate not only what they do, but what they might do in your scheme, you can make these bigger gambles with a little more security than you would do otherwise.
I think that's right. I think the sort of the underlying point there is that especially at elite levels of play, football is a highly contextual game. We've talked about that scheme matters so much. I think that's true. That's not limited to football. Obviously, in soccer, where StatsBomb has really paved the way in a lot of ways in this, it's what you want the player in that position to do determines the players you look for. It's a similar thing in basketball, maybe in different ways. Schematically, it might not be all that different, but roles vary very widely between team to team in terms of where a player might be in the hierarchy, how much he might have the ball, and so on. And if you're looking at just sort of production stats, you're losing that context. And so, okay, well, he was great there. What will he do for us? And I think that is both within sort of an NFL trades or free agency signing, but also, and even more so, I guess, given sort of the potential salary cap benefits of having players on rookie contracts doing this. All right, it would be great if everyone in FBS played in a quote pro style defense where they are making the same kind of drops and reads, and we can evaluate apples to apples. That's really not the case. Would you count the number of teams that play that way on two hands? And even if so, like the level of competition they're facing both from quarterback and like receiving talent is such that they're not really facing that same level of play. So
how do you quantify linebackers that are facing Navy on a regular basis, or Coastal Carolina and Liberty, right? Like, really interesting scheme up there. I actually love to watch their offense, but like, I can't necessarily say that anybody who's playing against it has a normal job in front of them. They have like a really warped job, which is useful in those situations, but probably less useful if you're trying to put it in a more homogenized league.
When you're talking about the Ravens, like with the Michigan connection with the brothers, and they passed so many defensive coaches back and forth, defensive coordinators kind of moving back and forth, like they almost have a farm system of, okay, I know this player has played in my exact system. Mm-hmm. Now we can see with the projection of how is this player, and this could maybe move on to another discussion really is, what do we do with measurables versus scheme, right? When you look at somebody like Grayson McCall, like from that Coastal offense you're talking about, set the NCAA record for passer rating, I think, which has now been broken. It's been broken like every year the past 5 or 6 years. It's wild. But, another player from that offense, Isaiah Likely, who is a tight end, which is another, it's, kind of a position similar to linebacker where, oftentimes in college you're asked to do one thing, and then in the pros it's, you block, you catch, and tight ends, they don't normally have a very successful first year or even two. You look at Travis Kelce, best receiving tight end in the league, potentially of all time, did not even really play his first year. And it's very rare for those players to play. And somebody like Isaiah Likely has had a lot of success early on. And I think that a lot of it goes into how well he has been placed in the specific positions, but then also the analysis of saying, all right, we see his measurables, we see what he can do, and then kind of morphing that into a plan for him once he gets to your team. And that's tricky. I mean, that's why they get paid the big bucks in the professional leagues for sure.
So let's get back more. We've been talking about this generally. Let's get back to it more from a data perspective. And again, sort of batting down the appeal to perfection. This is a hard task that we're doing. How can we do it a little better? What are some ways that you would approach identifying either players who are already participating in that sort of scheme, or markers that a player who maybe doesn't would be able to thrive in that?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think the really smart NFL teams have done recently is, the NFL Combine has been around for a really long time, and it's a great way to measure athleticism in specific areas, 40-yard dash. You even see that it's been the increase of looking at kind of the first 10, right? How quickly they get off the ball, bench press and other ways to test this. But teams are starting to use in-game tracking data to not just use kind of replacement metrics of saying like, okay, well, I'm interested in the strength of this player. We could look at how well he tests bench pressing, or we could look at their engagement data from StatsBomb. How much are they moving this player when they're asked to run block? We've talked about something at StatsBomb of like player load of, our offensive lineman that weighs 330 pounds pushes this D lineman who weighs 300 pounds. We're moving him a certain amount of yards. Like the actual in-game stuff is where it comes. Great examples from the Rams. They recently drafted Cooper Kupp, who, tested poorly. There's a big story about they had used some tracking data from just the Senior Bowl, I believe it was, seeing how fast he was running actually in game and using that as a measure for speed instead of just a pure 40 time, which, these guys are training for months just specifically for the combine. It's not about like football at that point. It's let's train for the combine to see how well we can do in those and hopefully fool a couple teams.
Yeah, let's line the physical data with the performance as directly as we possibly can, right? In many cases, what you're doing in a practice or in these combines is taking something that is a proxy for the performance. But if you get the data and you get the physical information on a frame by frame level as to this is what's actually the output looks like, now you're aligning those two much more tightly. And one of the things that Seth mentioned on scheme and what you can do with better data is to just take the risk a little bit less, right? To improve your confidence interval in a totally nerdy way to do it, or to just say, hey, we think that there's relatively low risk that this guy is different than the information that we have about him. And that's useful because otherwise, scouts have a varied set of information. I've worked with probably 50 scouts over the course of my career in the soccer side. And sometimes they are useful and sometimes they're useful in their own particular expertise. And sometimes they're useful, independently, but also not correlated together. And so you're like, this guy loves him. This guy hates him. Are we using the hate as a veto? Like if the analytics agree with both of them, or like if the analytics always love some particular set of guys, we're only letting them scout them because they look like they might be good enough for our team. I don't know. I think that like all you're trying to do as a person who does a lot of personnel work is to get a better projection on what this player looks like at the next level or in our particular scheme. And how do we minimize the cost and the likelihood this blows up? Or the flip side is, how do we maximize the upside on any particular one? So if you're like a first round pick, you're like, look, we got to have somebody that can play for us in the first season or two. If you're a fourth or fifth round pick, like, hey, this guy could eventually be a starter for us, and that's good enough. It changes on a case by case basis based on the stake that you have in the bet or free agency, which is, literally burnt money in some cases.
This is a good lead into next week since we're going to be at the combine, we'll be talking a little bit more about the combine. It's a little tease of one of my favorite concepts in analytics is something called Goodhart's Law, which is the common expression of it is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a useful measure. Essentially a very nerdy way of saying don't play the drill. But I think we'll talk about that more a little bit next week when we're going to be talking also about line play. Talk a little bit more about in specific how our data, I think, helps us identify the types of offensive linemen and how that might translate at the next level next week. And like I said at the start, if you are around Indy and want to say hey to us, give us a shout, and we will be out and about as the broader NFL world will all be next week. So any closing thoughts you want to give before we sign off for the week, Ted?
No, I think this is all pretty exciting. I'm looking forward to the combine next week. I love personnel and recruitment. I think that like anytime I always likened it to like fresh snow that like no one's been in. Like when you get that first layer after like 10 games, you get soccer data that you're looking at around the world. And you're like, all right, who looks good right now in sort of our parameters? And like, it's always really exciting. And you mentioned a guy last week that nobody had on their list as potential NBA players. And then you look at that sort of first cut of data after you've got enough games and you're like, that's interesting. Let's get on the tape and take a look at this guy. It's always fun.
And then it's always funny when the guy looks a little different. Like another player, his basketball example is since the All-Star break, it just happened in Indianapolis, and the sort of hometown face of it was Tyrese Halliburton, was a very unusual looking player, and both in terms of kind of size, skill set, production output, and you sort of the imagination to say, how might that work? And I think a lot of the revolutions we've seen in football have been various teams, at various levels imagining, okay, that doesn't fit the traditional mold, but there's something there. And I think that's the fascinating thing, in that it's not static. The tight end position, it wasn't that long ago that it was kind of an afterthought. And now it's among the most important offensive positions in the game, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, you look at when we're talking, I think we talked a little bit about it last week, but have a full article about the complexity and versatility of players, and specifically tight ends is one that is easy that comes to mind, right? And it was like the 60s when someone was like, hey, this big guy that can block can also catch. We should actually throw him the ball and we can do some really cool things with it. And the tight end position was created. But I think for me, I'm excited to see when the next new position is made, where it's, hey, this player that's really good at receiving is also really good at running the football from the backfield. When I was at the University of Virginia, we had a player who we would do a whole bunch of stuff with, and Seth is laughing because it's really corny and whatever, but we gave him the designation of a football player because there's not like a real great position in the true sense of positions for him when you do so many things. And so, you look at the fifth DB, is he a nickel? Is he a safety? Is he a corner? You look at the other DBs that are coming on the field for defense, offense, the more that you can do. I think this is how I finished my last article for StatsBomb. You can find it at StatsBomb_FB on Twitter or just on StatsBomb.com. But I worked with an offensive coordinator who I think stole this from Bill Belichick, but said, the more you can do, the more you can do. And in linebackers, if it's the more you can do coverage and rushing and blitzing and tackling, the more you're going to be able to do, the more you're going to be able to play. And so it's an interesting thing for me to see kind of where football is going, both offensively and defensively, to say these players are no longer just, hey, I'm a quote receiver. No, they're lining up in the backfield. It's Deebo Samuel. He's being handed the ball from a traditional running back role. Even the Chiefs in the Super Bowl, Rashee Rice, a rookie receiver, lined up in the backfield multiple times in the game, was handed the ball once, I think ran a route from the backfield. There's so much that you can do if you just broaden your horizons. Just think outside the box just a little bit. Like the Taco Bell, think outside the bun, think outside the box. You can do a lot.
And that's our second unpaid ad read of the week, and that's probably
if we could get Taco Bell to sponsor us, that is my number one desire.
If folks from Mountain Dew Baja Blast get at Matt, he will be in your debt forever. And on that note, for Matt and Ted, we're going to sign off for the week. We will talk to you again next week, both on the pod and in Indy at the Combine if you are there. Thanks a lot and take care.